Good planning is fundamentally a cognitive discipline before it becomes a technical one. In other words, your brain, my brain, it's been trained to think in a certain way. So I therefore still see planning, especially policy planning, as a creative, deep thinking, cognitive process.
In this episode of the Planners Podcast, I'm joined by Rosemary Daly, Northern Ireland's Chief Planner, and Philip McGowan, Joint Head of Regional Planning Policy with the Department for Infrastructure. We explore governance and planning improvement, plan making and development management, regional planning policy, the role of the planner, and what effective planning means for communities across the north of Ireland. Rosemary and Philip, you're very welcome to the podcast.
Glad to be here, Sean.
Thanks so much, Sean.
For listeners who might not know you, could both of you maybe introduce yourselves and your careers to date and your current role, and then also what a typical week or a typical day in the life of planners in the Department for Infrastructure, what it's like. So Rosemary, do you want to start first and explain your role and how you got there?
Thank you, Sean. Well, my role is Chief Planner in the Department for Infrastructure. I'm a Director of Regional Planning, Governance and Legislation. I have almost hit my 30 years working in planning in Ireland, specifically more the north of Ireland. Studied at Queen's environmental planning and then went on to study a master's in rural development. So that has taken me into this space. Commenced my career in the DOE, worked there for a few years, then was fortunate to get a position working in the private sector and consultancy, where gained a good insight into just the perspective of investors and developers and how projects are delivered, and seeing that side of the issues that come up in planning process, things like rollout of telecommunications, renewable energy projects, housing developments, education projects. So it was a very broad range of projects. 4 years in consultancy, I then joined the Planning Appeals Commission as a commissioner and worked my way through the commission in a number of various roles. That experience was a very valuable one. Also got to see a lot of across the system, worked in local development plans, considered many strategic decisions. But one of the things that was very, very relevant in that space was actually the importance of everybody's voice in making a decision. Obviously, in appeals, you're very much listening to all parties in making those decisions. And, you have to balance that and listen to the facts to make a very informed decision. So that was a great experience. So I spent 18 years in the Planning Appeals Commission, and then I joined Planning Consultancy again for a short period, a really good refresher as to how things are in the current economy. Done a number of really interesting projects in the south and worked with a few of the councils on master plans and worked with some renewable energy companies as well. That was really interesting just to get the perspective of just cross jurisdiction and how things are done differently between the north and the south. But I lasted there for about a very short period of 10 months and was very fortunate to apply for this job, and delighted to say that I'm nearly coming up in 2 years in this role, and I've enjoyed every day and worked with a very fantastic team here in DFI. I've had a lot of very positive, constructive engagement with our local councils and other stakeholders. It's a real pleasure to be here and a very enjoyable role. So that's really me, Sean, and that's where I'm at the moment.
Thanks, Rosemary. And Philip, can you explain your role and your career so far, which has been a long time in various iterations of the department, I think, and what you do now?
Yes, thanks for the long time reference there, Sean. Yes, by way of introduction, I'm currently a principal planner within the Department for Infrastructure, where I jointly lead the regional planning policy team. And I suppose, to be fair, it's a role I've been in now for a fair bit. But anyway, when I look back, I would maybe reflect that Rosemary's told a good, colourful story there, but certainly my career hasn't been linear either. And I think reflecting here, it's probably common enough in planning. I've met many planners that, they started out papering walls, so it's quite common. I graduated from Queen's University, Belfast in 1998, the 3+1 course that was on then. And I achieved first class honour, something I like to say. If I achieved nothing else in my career, I can always revert back to that. And early on, following graduation, I had a number of failed attempts at employment in the London Planning Advisory Service, for one, and with Cooperation Ireland. But thereafter, not dejected, I moved through a series of roles in academia, rural developments, and ultimately public sector planning. And I also dabbled in the private sector for a bit, working with a number of clients under the leadership of Peter Quinn, the former GAA president. Some of you might know, but I spent some time also in a research role and doing a bit of lecturing at Queen's and the Gibson Institute. And before that, I worked within a technical service team at the Rural Development Council in Cookstown. And there I learned to use new tools at the time, ArcView and GIS mapping and statistical software. And we produced rural community place profiles then. And I suppose I really enjoyed that early period, but I had always a sense that I wanted to be closer to maybe, public decision making. And I felt I wasn't really in the space of pure planning. So, you did what you had to do then. Maybe the opportunities weren't as rife as they might be today, but I felt I needed to go and play my learned trade proper, if you like. So despite a counter offer of a full-time job within the School of Architecture at Queen's, I hesitantly moved to the public sector and I started out working in the OMA Divisional Planning Office. And that's really where my career started. I can remember it was an incredibly exciting time. It was characterised by an awful lot of recruitment then, a sense of professionalising the service, and there was a real vibrancy and energy and a youthful sense about the place with opportunities following. I quickly got a number of promotions, and I suppose thinking here, a lot of people have gone through the OMA Divisional Planning Office. I meet it. Certainly, Rosemary was in there for a time, and I have to say some of my fondest memories are of that period. But after 3 or 4 years working in OMA on both the Cookstown and Dungannon area plans, I then moved into regional spatial planning in central government within the Department for Regional Development in Belfast. And I must say this was something of a significant shift for me. So from local area-based work and issues, I now had to think about the bigger picture across the entire region and think more long-term, if you like. And I was also very much thrust into the political side of planning. And even today, thinking about it, I do remember it. I'll never forget it. My second day into that job, I was the new greenhorn into the team, but nonetheless, the director sent me to go deputise for him at a meeting in the bowels of Stormont, a place I'd never even been. And I can still vividly feel now the fear I felt then sitting round the table during a period of direct rule with former ministers of state, John Speller and Angela Smith. So the experience was really very much a deep end moment, sink or swim scenario, but one that quickly brought me up to speed with how things operate in central government. So at 5 years in DRD, I then took the opportunity to move back to planning policy, which I always enjoyed. And there I worked on a number of policy initiatives, including new policy provisions in respect of safeguarding the character of established residential areas. And even now, that's something I'm particularly proud of. So since 2012, I've been working within DFA, leading a team at the heart of regional planning policy, supporting DFA ministers and senior leadership team, including Rosemary here, helping to deliver policy changes like the strategic planning policy statement, which underpins the two-tier system here, and recent revisions to it in the form of revised policy on renewable and low carbon energy. And I'm sure you get this all the time, Sean, but you've asked us what a typical week looks like, Sean, and you probably know the answer anyway, but there's not really such a thing when you become a planner. Of course, there's the usual activities, far too many emails to get through. There's the team and the project management activities, but generally the role's incredibly varied. So in any given week, I could be engaging with councils or other stakeholders. I could be handling hot potatoes or dealing with live policy issues of the day. I could be involved in legal matters or complaints or preparing for assembly business. I would say this, I've been in policy quite a while now, but I really don't need to actively seek out variety, because variety, and sometimes Rosemary, always find me. I get involved in a lot of things, and I'll be honest, it can be challenging and hectic at times, but I guess that's what makes the role interesting and rewarding.
And before we drill into that day-to-day stuff, can I take you both back to before you studied planning? And I won't ask if you got a first as well, Rosemary, but why did you decide to study planning in the first place? Did you know what you were getting into, or what led you to doing that course at the very beginning?
It's really, Sean, if I think back to when I was doing my GCSE with a fantastic geography teacher, and always remembered the human side of the geography. Really, I had a passion about it, about, the environment and the interactions of people with the environment. This is a subject I really enjoyed and obviously excelled quite well at it. Continued on to do my A-level geography. I worked closely with the universities as well, making sure there's opportunities for progression into a career. But it's actually making geography students aware that this is a clear pathway. I also feel that the career, as well as I, coming from a rural area myself, I feel the sense of community is a very important part. And I think the link between planning and community is really a very important part of how you think and process things, and the impacts of decisions and the impacts of things that are good for the community and things that can have an impact on the community. So working with people is something I'm also very passionate about. We're delighted that in the North here we have many options of different varieties of courses that can lead people in and into the career. Actually, if you think back, that was quite a very attractive, to have that title in your degree was quite impressive for its time, because you're thinking about how to plan for the environment. And obviously in that, the threads of the community, the environment and the economy all come into that. So I just seem to find my fate, and it's something that I'm always very proud of. I really love promoting the profession. Just as Philip just described, there isn't a typical day, there isn't a typical week. It's such a variety. And no matter what role I've been in, it has always been the same. As a planner, can make sense of things. I mean, I was talking to a group recently and I said, planning involves a lot of engineering solutions, but planners can take that technical information and communicate that very easily to people and, write policies as to why we process things in certain ways. And give respect to Philip. I remember Philip as a budding student coming to OMA and been very impressed about his contribution, and already he was in that space. And again, as Philip said, I have very fond memories about working in the OMA Divisional Planning Office as well. And it obviously was a very good time to be in planning. It was seen as very opportunistic. There was lots of variation. It was almost, a lot of changes around even at that stage, bringing in new IT, looking at new processes, updating local development plans, pretty much similar issues that we're dealing with today. But that was really the start of making it more of a professional contribution rather than just a sort of civil service-led role of the civil service. The other thing that really attracts me to planning is there is something for everyone. I look at the broad range of responsibilities that the department has here, and there's issues right in legislation, there's policies, there's considerable applications, and that goes right through, and even in local councils as well. The variety of what you could be involved in, and no two cases are ever the same. So it just brings such an interest, and the interactions with the people behind the cases or the communities that development proposals are in. So you have an opportunity here as a planner, to assist and facilitate and help realise development in areas that are good for the community and good for the environment.
Philip, briefly, can you explain, apart from obviously having a natural aptitude for it, why did you study planning in Queen's?
I'll try to keep it brief, but my backstory is quite a long and interesting one. I suppose I grew up in Fermanagh, so naturally I had an appreciation of the environment around me. I was also a bit of a deep thinker at heart, and someone that was naturally curious about the world. I've also a bit of creativity in me. I have A-levels in art and music, and I also have an A-level in religion, and I'm sure it's not a prerequisite to becoming a planner, but certainly in my career I've needed a few days of divine intervention to get me through. And would you believe it, I started out studying at University of Ulster. I started out studying business and accounting, but I quickly realised it wasn't for me. Towards the end of the first year, I decided to go and have a duke at the Queen's Prospectus, and really that's where I got drawn in, to answer your question. So I loved the idea that there was a broad range of subjects. The urban design obviously appealing to my creative side. There's a bit of geography, history of settlement. I remember with planning law, GIS again, and there was a bit of philosophy and sociology, and I'm sure Rosemary will recall Bill Neal's epistemological imagination lectures. I started that course the following September, and I really must say I enjoyed the initial studio and design based work, and indeed watercolouring lessons with the late David Evans with a snuff box. There's some of my memories, and we worked alongside future architects. But maybe it was the deep thinker in me, Sean, that what really stayed with me was the idea that planning's about the public good. I have to say that the late great John Greer, who co-founded the planning school, was a big influence on me in my time in Queen's. The truth to tell, to steal one of his expressions. And I remember complaining to John one day. It was probably after a sociology lecture, to be fair, but I was complaining about the lack of technical skills being taught. And his answers always stayed with me. And I probably not do justice to the actual words he used, but it was something like, Philip, good planning is fundamentally a cognitive discipline before it becomes a technical one. In other words, your brain, my brain, it's been trained to think in a certain way. So I therefore still see planning, especially policy planning, as a creative, deep thinking, cognitive process. It's about bringing together different perspectives, balancing those competing interests, solving problems with people, and developing thoughtful, well-reasoned policies that I hope lead to better outcomes. So in short, it's that mix of creativity, the problem solving, and working in the public interest has kept me interested and curious.
And Philip, for listeners who might not know or might not be working in the system at the moment, can you explain the DFI's role and its responsibilities, and I guess the role that the department plays in the planning system in the North?
Well, DFI was created in 2016. It followed the advent of a new system on the 1st of April 2015 and the most fundamental reforms to it in 4 decades. And I suppose on the surface, that might seem like a fairly straightforward question, but reflecting back the time since, we have a hypothetical role, and then, the departments had to maybe, pivot and be agile around that role at various stages. And maybe looking forward, it might, take a fresh view at the role it performs. But to answer your question, I would say that fundamentally the department has a central leadership and oversight role within the planning system here. At a strategic level, the department's responsible for spatial planning, including the regional development strategy, and of course for setting regional planning policy through the strategic planning policy statement, which sits at the top of the policy hierarchy. The department is also responsible for, the legislative framework and for preparing guidance and a whole raft of guidance that can help ensure that system operates effectively and efficiently. And whilst most day-to-day decisions are now made by councils, and those councils are also responsible for preparing their own local development plans, the department retains several other important functions. These include oversight and performance management, determining reasonably significant and called-in applications, providing ad hoc advice and support to councils, and an important plan oversight role. So overall, the department's primary role is about setting strategic direction on the one hand and supporting the effective operation of the tutor system on the other.
And Rosemary, can we drill into some of those things that Philip introduced there, and what are the department's main priorities when it comes to planning at the moment?
Obviously, Sean, we have to realise the Minister's priorities, so that's very, very important. And our Minister is very supportive and understands the importance of having a very efficient and effective planning system. And we often hear, a call for reform of planning. We have just gone through a massive reform in Northern Ireland. You've heard it all before, I'm sure, Sean, at this stage. But that was a fundamental change as to how, just how the administration of planning across the system. Planning responsibilities were given to councils. Councils have never had this before in Northern Ireland. We're very passionate about the planning improvement programme that the Minister really is behind in terms of trying to deliver these efficiencies and effectiveness. And a big part of it is actually around the culture and the people and how we all see each other in this position. If you can imagine, everything has just been scattered out and things have bedded in, and now people are getting to understand what our role is. We have very much worked very hard and will continue to work very hard with all the key stakeholders. So everybody, and that goes from, the private sector as well, to communities, to stakeholders, the statutory consultees, anybody who engages the system, for them to understand that you have a role to play and you have a voice, and we're listening to that voice, but you have to understand there has to be a commonality in terms of achieving outcomes. So very much the priority is in looking at where we're at, and always the culture is to embed continuous improvement in the planning system. So we've obviously gone through change. There's things that are very good and working well in the system, but there is things that we know there are problems. And it's really identifying what the main problems are and how to work through those. So before we go into the steps of another new planning bill, we really want to have a really good vision as to how that will be realised. We also want to look at, how our policies are delivered in the framework for our policies. And we really want to look at other jurisdictions and learn from how they've embedded in other places, particularly, in the South, you're going through the new planning bill, and we'd like to just see how that's all working out before we get into the next step. We also see that across the councils, planning is very adversarial. Planners are seen to be barriers to good decisions, but actually, in actual fact, they're facilitators. We have a system here in Northern Ireland that actually works very closely with lots of agents when they put in information that isn't right, or they put in something, or they tackle concerns that are raised by third parties. So we very much try to get the right decision. Unfortunately, not getting the right decision sometimes takes time, but with that, at least everyone will have had their opportunity to come into the system. So it's very much looking at how we can balance, timely decisions with good quality decisions and ensuring that everyone has had their opportunity to participate. So we've had a number of mechanisms around improvements around validation checklists, our pre-application consultation processes, obviously respecting that councils can be on board, make life more efficient for them in the process. So that's a very key area. Policy reform is another one. We always have to keep up to date. Philip's very much in this space. Keep up to date with the changes, particularly around climate, economic investment, and around protecting society. There's lots of issues the planning system is expected to deliver. You're looking at social housing, but you're also looking at health and well-being and all those aspects. There's a massive area of work. And as I'm sure you've seen this all, and Philip will probably agree with me, since starting out in the world of planning for me in the past 30 years, there's such a variety, and the expanse of the role of planners have become even more, and it's increasing all the time. And issues that you can't believe that never were a planning matter before are now clearly planning issues that we all have to tackle and deal with. The portfolio of considerations continues to expand all the time. And that's okay, because just as Philip's described, and back to John Greer, an influential person in my career as well, and obviously a very good founder of the Irish Planning Institute. John certainly opened up the opportunities at a local level, that sort of bottom-up approach where local communities can take responsibility and work through to achieve better outcomes. And certainly it was very inspiring in how I would approach things. So back to the points, the main priorities really are about improving the planning system in the best way that we can to ensure it delivers for all aspects of society and investment and communities as well.
Can we drill into just some of those a bit more? So on the plan making side, can you bring us up to date with the status and maybe the timeline that you think is going to be there for the adoption of the local development plans?
So we have, obviously in the north here, we have a 2-stage plan process. Again, it's into that this is responsibility of local councils to make the local development plans. And with that comes a massive opportunity. It allows councils to shape their policies as to how they see in their areas, obviously in the soundness of regional policy. So it's a big task, but in shaping your policies and building why you want that uniqueness, you have to have the evidence base to demonstrate the deviation from regional policy. So we're in a position now where quite a number of our councils have adopted plan strategies, which is the first stage of the plan. And now these councils are now moving into their second stage. We have some councils that are coming up with their draft plans. They're out for publication at the moment and obviously are getting lined up for public inquiries. And to be fair, it would have been unrealistic at the time. Northern Ireland is a small region, and it would have been unrealistic at the time to think that every council could actually produce the plan, deliver the plan within 2 years, because the system overall couldn't have taken that impact. So for some councils to, watch and learn, for some councils to take the time, and even before we did the process, different councils, extant plans were at different stages. So obviously that is entirely a matter for the councils. But that said, we do want to have the certainty of the local plans. There is a lot of criticisms around the time that it has taken. We are now 11 years and we still don't have a full suite of plans. But to be fair, and this doesn't give any excuse to that process, I don't actually recall a time, and I'm sure Philip can back me up, I don't recall a time whenever there was always, plans are iterative, they move with time. So just when you've got one finish, you start again. So it's something that, it's not going to be the ideal world that you'd think that every council should have their plan in place at a point in time. However, the plan system, the LDP process, is something we're very focused on. And as I've mentioned before, we have the Plan Improvement Programme, which we work through, and actually streamlining and improving the LDP process is certainly an area that we're very keen to work with local councils as to how we can do things more efficiently. And that's taking the learning from what we've got, from what we had before. We also have obviously secured funding under the Transformation Fund to appoint independent inspectors, which is a fantastic, innovative way of delivering extra and additional capacity in the planning system. Obviously, our local development plans, unlike the South, go through a public examination. So, there is the concern that if another tranche of these plans come at the same time, is there capacity with the Planning Appeals Commission? But thankfully, our Minister has secured transformation funding to allow us to appoint independent inspectors. The likes of that programme is really innovative. It's just stepping back and saying, well, can we do this a different way? The department holds legislation to appoint independent inspectors, so it's us using our legislation to do that process. So it's very much, and it's also getting councils as well to recognise the value of having their own local development plans. It's very important because that is the outworking of the policy framework. And, to have that shape. And I do think it's very important that local people have influence over, the policies and what they see are priorities in their area. And, that goes through a proper procedure to identify and obviously implement those policies. And whilst we do have criticisms we have 6 plan strategies adopted across the North, and there is slight variations, and that is difficult for the profession to, where you've gone from a position where it was all the same policy applied across the board now to what are they saying in each of the council areas. It's just another technical piece of experience the planners have to pick up that that makes life difficult again, and also the public. But that's where the role of the planner comes in, to make sense of that and identify the nuances in the different policies. It's an exciting time, and the LDP process was one of the big opportunities that the reform in 2015 did bring about. And it's something that's very welcomed. And it's certainly, even though, taking and getting your documents published, once it's published and you've got the draft, everything actually has moved a lot quicker than it has previously. So there is a lot to be said for that. But, there is a lot of responsibility on councils collecting all the evidence to make their plan. And that's probably where resource implications around providing that information as well.
And acknowledging that you don't want a static, or you can't expect to have a kind of static suite of plans, and there will always be changes at some level. Is there a kind of date that you're expecting the full suite of plans to be in place? Or is it going to be, well, obviously it's sitting with the council, so is it going to depend on individual councils, or do you expect things to be complete by a certain point in time?
I wouldn't like to put a date on it, Sean, because it's not within our remit. You have to respect that each of the councils are their own independent body, and they have to decide what their priorities are. We would hope that councils do consider the local development plan as a priority. However, that it's all subject to, resourcing and maybe what else is going on in the council. So, what we would hope is that we move through, that all councils will want to have their plans in place as quickly as possible. And some have, moved very quickly and have that, or are on the second stage and are already through that, coming well through that process as well. Again, it's not something that we're in the mind at this stage anyway to, enforce that you should have your plan.
And I know you're collecting a lot of performance data. You talked about the planning improvement programme and direct engagement with councils and planning teams and councils and things like that. Can you talk to me a little bit more about what you are trying to achieve through the planning improvement process and what you're learning from that sort of engagement with the individual councils? One
of the things I would say in the planning system is I think there is unjust criticism. I do think that people are very focused, and I suppose this is a part of the plan improvement programme we want to get to, is what is good performance. Our planning system actually delivers over 97% of approval rate. So there has to be, and there's quite a high number of applications go through our system, relatively speaking, probably higher than maybe other council areas across the island of Ireland. Our councils work very hard in very difficult circumstances, new processes, bedding in with new procedures. So picking up those processes, procedures, and just the dynamics of the council, that isn't something that you can just fix. That's something that people feel and react to. And, there's culture with that as well in each council. But what I'm hoping is that, I think it's very important to build the profile of planners in any organisation. I think it's also very important to build the value of planners in the organisations that they work in. The Plan Improvement Programme basically moved into a second phase where we're trying to make it very flexible, that this allows governed way for the department and the councils to work together on issues. So that's a big thing, is that partnership and collaborative approach. So that's a key thread through it. It means it can be flexible, that when there's a need to bring something in that we need to work together with, we can do that, because it's a 2-tier system in Northern Ireland, and we both have roles to play and we've our job to do, but likewise we have to respect the councils have a job to do. So I suppose it's making people understand that the councils have that power, that they have powers for delivering decisions. But back to your question, really, Sean, and around us, what we expect to get out of it's also to give an assurance that there is that programme there, that, we are very focused on the efficiencies effects of the planning system. And there's mechanisms there that we can look at that. And it's always good to, not set out and think that this is what will happen, because circumstances change. We can adopt that programme. And I mean, it's very interesting because some people have come to me and said, so when that programme is delivered, is that it is fixed? But that's not how planning works, because again, as I've said, it changes all the time and your programme has to be reactive to the circumstances of the day. So it's to give the public assurances that we do work in collaboration with councils. And we're starting to see that collaboration is working really well. You're getting honest feedback and we want to react to that in the best way we can. But sometimes whenever you are dealing with so many stakeholders, things do take time because you're listening and you're reacting to that. And you have to respect for that. So I think it's very important that the potential for, that is realised.
So one thing that we've talked about, Rosemary, is change and the place of planning within that and demands for reform and people maybe being dissatisfied, notwithstanding the approval rate and things like that. But can you talk to me a little more about the context that the planning system in the north of Ireland is operating under? And I'm thinking about, I suppose, a perception that it's increasingly complex, the role of the courts, the increased complexity of environmental assessment, and I suppose where you think that is going and whether you think things have become more complicated and more complex for planners.
There's absolutely no doubt, Sean, things have got more complex. I mean, there's regulations, there's legislation now that we didn't have to deal with. There's nuances in policy that were not there before that are there. There's also, the participation of people in the planning system has absolutely increased and people understanding that they have their rights to participate. So it's accommodating all of that in the system and it's accommodating in the right way to make the right decision. That's back to my point is, people will focus on, the timeliness as a measurement of performance. And it is one measurement, but there's also, have people had a fair hearing? Have they had a good service? Have they got the decision they want? In making planning decisions, there's loads of ways around. You may get the decision that you don't want, but has the concern that you have had and raised in that decision been mitigated or conditioned? And understanding that, the mechanisms and why things are the way they are. And I think I always look back to our former days in the DOE, and certainly simplifying things for people is really important and putting things into, where the reasonable person can understand why that was processed in such a way and why things in the planning system happen in the way they happen. But it's ensuring that even professionals are aware of that and that the professionals act in a professional way to ensure good quality comes into the system to allow our planning officers to look at the application and begin the process. And we do put a lot of emphasis on pre-application consultation here in the north. We put a lot of emphasis on the planning application consultation as well with communities. So because we're more outreaching, it is more complex because you're listening to more voices, but that's important. And, I think that's actually the value of planning, that those mechanisms and that regulation is there to allow that all to happen. Big challenge. I think it is going to get more complex. We've got more legislation that will probably come. And every time you make legislation, believe it or not, to make something simple, it actually adds another layer of, regulation that you have to comply with. So this is where I would be, before we get into detailing and scoping out what planning reform would be for Northern Ireland, we'd like to really get into looking at what's the best way. The systems are becoming very, very complex. The information that needs to go into making a planning decision is very complex. We've just issued validation checklists, but that complexity is there is because we have more participation in the system. The people want to see, how are you addressing the environment? How are you looking after protected species? How are you considering, the character of the area? All those things are very, very important. How are you protecting that listed building? How have you dealt with environmental concerns here? All of those things, and the delivery of infrastructure is very important as well, and how that impacts on people as well. So, it just doesn't come easy. The judicial process, particularly I think in Ireland across the board, is, very leading in this area. We do have people who do challenge. It's a very low bar to challenge a planning decision, and that happens very regularly. People do know their rights, and that's what you want. But at the same time, it does tend to stymie investment and delivery of infrastructure that we need. So the complexity is definitely there, Sean, and it is building, and I've no doubt that it's not going to change.
And looking inward, and you mentioned resourcing previously, how significant is that resourcing and kind of that workforce challenge and maybe that skills challenge? And I don't think we're talking just about planners here as well. We're talking about other specialists too that support the work of planners. But how significant is that challenge for you and for the system in the North? And what are you trying to do, or what do you think can be done to attract and actually retain planners into the public and the private sector, I guess?
I think the challenge is definitely there, and I think it's actually the skill sets that are required to be a planner are very varied, and there is something for everyone. As Philip has talked about earlier, you have someone who's very passionate about design, or someone's very passionate about the environment, someone that's very passionate about renewables, someone's, conservation, all those things, it's all there. I think it's very important to resource system that we have the skill sets and understand what the skill sets are that we need to deliver good planning. We in the department are very key, very much in that space. We really want to look at how we can not only build the capability, but also capacity. You'll be aware, Sean, that we've undertaken our new trainee planner, and we've delivered that this year in collaboration with 4 of our councils across the North. And that's been a real success, and it's been really enlightening. We have been very fortunate here in the department to actually bring across people from other arms of the civil service, which is a really fantastic opportunity for those people, but also a great opportunity for ourselves, because these are skilled people who have, various backgrounds, and the more variety the backgrounds of people in planning, the better. I think that takes everyone. You have people like Philip here, who's obviously quite academic, but you also need people who can sit and analyse figures and performance. You need people who can, have good writing skills to put up cases. You need people who have presentation skills. You need people who have good analytical skills. You need people who can be deep thinkers. You need people who can interact with the public. So there's such a variety of skills that planners need. And it takes everyone. And it's really, I think one of the things I think is very important is to have good teams that we can work at. The department here have spent quite a bit of time in the last few years investing in training their management leadership of our teams. And that's really, really important, because those skills are also very important in the world of planning, where, you understand that there's a role for everyone. So there's people that like to be social, like to discuss things with people. I have to say I'd probably be one of them. And you have other people who just want to get on and write the report. So that opportunity for the skills and planning are brilliant. And I think there's a role for all types. We're very encouraging of that. We really see that building capability is important across the system. And I think the more we build that capability as a collective across the region is much better than, individually with the councils. Obviously, councils will see their own training needs and they're only right to fulfil those training needs. But in our role as a department with oversight, and certainly even in the role as chief planner, we've delivered one last year on fraud in planning. We've been involved in renewables and planning. And sometimes those things are just, even the roundtable discussion that happens and the experience in different areas and what you've learned is really important. And actually, Sean, the conference delivered by the IPI is also a real value in that space as well, because that cross-learning of different jurisdictions, I have to say, I've found to be very inspiring and very much, we can learn from each other, and it's really refreshing.
That does bring me to something that I wanted to ask you, Philip, about that cross-border cooperation piece, and maybe if there's certain things you think lend themselves best to more cross-border cooperation, or that are currently working well at that kind of cross-border level, or if there's more you think could be done in that space.
Well, I suppose, Sean, certainly what Rosemary was saying there, obviously it's looking inwardly in terms of the context of the situation in the North, but certainly it's probably a conversation that could equally occur within the system in the South. And to my mind, I suppose it very much depends on how much one puts a focus on the border, if you like. I suppose many of our listeners today maybe would be lucky enough not to remember the physical border infrastructure that did exist. So look, it is important to acknowledge and recognise, the differences between planning systems North and South, and the different political systems at play. But, in terms of this conversation, I think there should be little by way of barriers to what is a community of planning professionals sharing and learning together. And that's whether you're working in Tyrone or maybe Tipperary. So in my view, anyway, is that this audience has a potential to deep border the consideration of these shared challenges across the island. And Rosemary mentioned some of them already, skills and resourcing, but certainly there are planning topics like climate action, renewables, environmental governance, flood risk management. But equally, I feel, there's lots of conversations to be had for mutual gain, north and south, when we talk about member-centred issues such as resourcing and skills and training. And also, I feel we could maybe do better in terms of supporting the health and well-being of professional planners through their careers. There are times it can be brutal, challenging, but fundamentally it is rewarding. And it's a good question to ask of me. I recall doing a dissertation at uni titled The Contribution of Community-Led Approaches to Cross-Border Planning. And I suppose there were probably fewer formal structures for cooperation then that maybe exist now, but there were evidence of area-based networks out with the formal planning systems that supported communication and cooperation between local authorities either side of the border. And to pause, these communities get on with their natural hinterland irrespective of the border or structures or systems anyway, and work naturally for mutual betterment. But I certainly referenced the Irish Central Border Area Network in my research, and I suppose more contemporary, you couldn't not mention the recent examples of successful cross-border cooperation and collaboration through the work of the Northwest Strategic Growth Partnership. And some listeners will be aware that its aim is to stimulate economic development and investment, community cohesion and overall well-being up there. And your question, Sean, is probably a very timely one. And I would point your listeners to a much better consideration of cross-border planning issues than I have articulated here. And that would be as contained in the ICLRD and Research Partners report titled Strategic Spatial Planning and the Framework for Cooperation. And this work was published in April. It's a very good and welcome piece of research, and I think it maybe provides a fresh platform to give the matter of cross-border cooperation renewed attention and revival. Going forward, I'm sure your listeners will agree, many of the pressures, not to go over what Rosemary was saying, but there is that increased complexity, increasing environmental requirements to meet, and ever-growing expectations from communities. These are common issues across the island. So I think we need to grow and develop our collaboration dialogue as a professional community so that shared learning can be brought to bear.
And sticking with you, Philip, as we come to the end, what advice would you give to younger planners starting out, whether they're in Tyrone or Tipperary or wherever they're working? What do you think they need to reflect on or learn, or what opportunities do you think they might have over the course of their career that you'd like to remind them of?
That's another question that hurts. I used to think I was a young planner, but maybe coming to the reality that 26 years in to planning, I'm probably one of the oldies now. So, I mean, if I was to look back and think about how I began my early career, and this is not something I did particularly well, but I would say a few things to young planners. For example, I would say keep your curiosity alive, because it's that curiosity that probably got you into planning, so don't forget it. I would say get involved and be visible. But most importantly, and I happened to say this to my daughter, who had her last day at big school very recently in a bit of a celebration. And I remember saying to Nessa, I said, and it applies equally to young planners, it's stay connected, because it's probably something I didn't appreciate as well then as maybe I do now. And it's true to say that planning really comes alive when you are engaged in the conversation. So do get immersed and involved. Say yes to opportunities, even if they're going to challenge you, and help out and participate in professional bodies. But just to rehearse that point again, keep foremost in your mind that the relationships you build early in your career follow you for decades.
Thanks, Philip. And Rosemary, last word to you. If you could send one message to those working with the planning system, with the public or private sector, third parties, communities, what message would you like to give people who are working and engaging with the system?
I would say the big key message, and this is actually just from my understanding and just my experience, is that the planning system is not detached from reality. and everyone has a shared responsibility because everybody's inputs are valuable. There's a very difficult job to do as a planner, but you have a role to play, and just having mutual respect for everybody's opinion and considerations, really to say that the big takeaway is that we have a shared responsibility. Planning is about public interest. So there's a shared responsibility for us all in that public interest. That's really would be my takeaway, is that we all have a role to play. Investors have a role to play to be respectful to the areas that they work within. Communities have a role to play to respect that someone wants to possibly come and invest in your area, but do it sensitively. Planners want to work. Ultimately, we want to deliver decisions. We want to deliver good policies. We want to deliver a good system. There is that want to do that. We work in very adversarial conditions sometimes. That is challenging, but as Philip has said, it's very rewarding. So the big takeaway for me is the more we work together, the better we will achieve in the world of planning.
Rosemary Daly, Philip McGowan, thanks a million for joining me. If you would like to find out more about what we covered in this episode, you'll find notes, links, and more in the description area of this podcast. Do remember to press follow for our show so you'll get the next episode automatically, and remember to share it with a friend in the sector. Just tell them to search Irish Planning Institute on their podcast app. Our podcast today was produced by dustpod.io and brought to you by the Irish Planning Institute. From me, Sean O'Leary, thank you for listening.